Hey there, hey, this is your girl Deja, and the host of Black and Wild, the podcast. This podcast focuses on highlighting underrepresented stories in outdoor spaces, whether that is in the field of conservation or recreation. Each episode will consist mainly of conversations between myself and my friends as we share what our experiences have been like in outdoor spaces. In this episode of Black and Wild, I have a conversation with my friend Karla that I met through my work in the nonprofit side of conservation. During our discussion, we highlight the many ways that people can connect with the outdoors, how the culture of these spaces can feel exclusive at times, and what their experience has been like as a first generation Mexican American. I do want to note that the opinions represented in this podcast and during this episode do not represent other agencies or organizations. Without further ado, let's get into that discussion. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Karla.
Hi, Deja.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Really been looking forward to our discussion, and I feel like, our connection through NPS Academy, as well as, both of us being women of color in the conservation industry. I feel like your story deserves to be heard and shared. And so I appreciate you being willing to participate in this conversation with me today. So I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself, like telling the world who you are and just what you would like to share about yourself in regards to this podcast, this show that's really focused on, really trying to share those underrepresented stories in conservation. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Deja. I'm Karla. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a NPS Academy alum, and I'm a new person pursuing a field or career in the conservation field. So thank you so much, Deja, for having me. I'm very excited to share my story and have this conversation with you.
And do you want to share a little bit about how we met?
For sure. So Deja and I, we both met through this really special program, NPS Academy, National, also known as like National Park Service Academy. This program is meant to uplift historically underrepresented groups as they begin or jumpstart their career in the Park Service or also the conservation field. So it doesn't necessarily have to tie into the NPS. And that's kind of the way that I've seen NPS Academy work for me. Um, so yeah, we met because Deja was the peer mentor lead, and then after Deja, you became one of my like co-supervisors for my position as an NPSA member. And then we happily crossed paths again this past March in the NPS Academy March experience, which was very, very special once again.
Where Karla came back as a peer mentor this time. So we've had quite a bit of full circle moments where I was kind of a peer mentor to you and you were a member, and then I was your supervisor, and then you came back as a peer mentor. And yeah, now we're kind of coworkers in this field of conservation almost. Like you are now a young professional in this field, which is really exciting to have seen your journey, leading up to NPS Academy, and also what you've been able to, experience and take away from that program, and then what you've done afterwards. So I'm so excited to be a part of your journey, but also to know you. And it's been really inspiring just to get to know you better, but also to see, all that you have done to contribute back to like protecting these places that are so special and beautiful while also like representing. So we definitely need some more representation out here.
I 100% agree. Yeah, and these opportunities have been very rewarding and also an opportunity to uncover a lot about myself. And really, I didn't grow up growing to national parks really, and I don't come from a very outdoorsy family either. So this feels like it's almost, I'm like very much new to this and I'm still learning and it's been like a whole adventure. Both good and both the good and here and there the bad. But really all around it has been rewarding to me as an individual. And yeah, I've been really enjoying what these experiences have brought to me in my life.
Yeah. So, Carla, speaking of, how you grew up and what your experience was like, leading up into you starting this career and this path into conservation, can you tell me a little bit more about like what your experience is like with the outdoors, like your relationship to outdoor spaces and like how that was introduced to you with you growing up and like leading up to your now career?
Yeah, for sure. Um, so my family, I'm just to throw that out there, I am like a first generation American. So I come from a Hispanic household who the outdoors was very much kind of like how you actually shared, Deja, and I related a lot with it was going to the beach and that was it. So we'd go to the beach quite often, but really it wasn't like we were going to all these national parks really at all. I grew up in Arizona, so I do remember going to the Grand Canyon one summer with my family, but even then, my parents are more of a, okay, we're gonna drive around and it's more like scenic views and take a picture here and take a picture there. But it wasn't like we were going camping or backpacking and doing all these like really intense trips at all. Um, and also just like redefining my own relationship with the outdoors is something that has been like one of my ongoing, like ever changing things in my life. Because I'm very much the like, I've worked in these a handful of national parks now, so I've been kind of thrown into that world. And I even find myself like kind of like turning, where I'm like wearing the chacos and going on these like backpacking trips and it's like really something new. So it's for me and really the people that I've been working with, like seeing how they're so used to that and then me coming in from like, okay, I'm very much not used to that, but then I don't want to be, I found myself being like, well, I don't, I kind of want to like blend in when there's really nothing wrong for me. Like it's really, there's nothing wrong with that not being my background. Um, but so with it was like with my family would be like a 1 mile hike and then my parents would be like, that's too much. So,
Right? Like that planted the seed for you to like want to go further. Maybe you didn't realize it in that moment, but it sounds like, those that sounds like a memorable experience for you. And I think that's something that coming into these outdoor spaces, we feel this pressure of like fitting in. Like you should be wearing these certain like outdoor brands and you should be having a certain appearance to you and you should be recreating in a certain way. But I'm just so happy to hear that, like, especially places like the national parks that historically are not always welcoming to people of color. And especially seeing people who are wearing uniforms that honestly reflect military and police uniforms. It's intimidating. And so I'm so glad to hear that like your family still at least tried and to try to experience it in a way that felt comfortable for them. It's like really beautiful to hear that because I think that that's something, I'm still starting to see, and it's not super common, but I'm glad that you guys were out there and just trying. Could you tell me about a little bit more about like what were those experiences like for your family? What were those discussions around like, okay, we're gonna go to the Grand Canyon today? And like, what were your experience like when you guys were walking around, national parks or outdoor spaces or, at the beach? Like, were you given weird looks or anything? Like, can you tell me a little bit about what led up to it, those discussions you had with them, and then what your experiences were like once you were in those places?
yeah, so I remember that Grand Canyon trip specifically, like looking back at it now, like again, like having been more exposed to this conservation world, we were definitely not prepared is one thing. Like it wasn't like we were like discussing how much water we should bring and what shoes we were going to wear. Like it was very much like, like even now that I've like worked in these spaces where I'm like giving these like educational hikes and like tours, I very much emphasize, okay, like I want to prepare my audience. So I'm coming in with this perspective now. And then looking back at the fact that we very much like had no clue about what we were like of what we were doing is kind of funny, but then also, it's kind of like coming back to, for me personally, especially since I work in front facing spaces where I'm interacting with a lot of different people every day that have different backgrounds. It's for me personally redefining what being outdoorsy or what it means to recreate outside and how that looks very different for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
for my family, growing up, like being outside was like, okay, we're gonna go down to the beach in Mexico, and that was very comfortable because that's like home for me and for my family, of course. So that was very comfortable. And then when we were in like visiting the Grand Canyon, even though it never felt, I guess it like in a way was very much, we didn't have that pressure really since we were, I didn't like my parents didn't grow up with that like environment. And like I hadn't quite yet like become involved in these spaces. When we were like in the Grand Canyon, for example, it wasn't like we were, oh my gosh, we have to, do this like 8 mile hike or backpacking trip. It kind of felt like we were just existing and enjoying the spaces. Um, just, we were recreating in our own ways, even if that didn't look, I think there's no right way to enjoy the outdoors and nature. So it's a constant, especially now where I'm very much surrounded with these people that do have that very much like, okay, yeah, we were camping all the time. Like my family and I, we would do like backpacking trips where, I have to like remind myself that it's okay if I didn't, and because that's not the reality for a lot of people in this country.
True. That's very true.
Mm.
I'm so glad to hear that you didn't have that experience of, people judging your family for how you guys were experiencing that space. And I'm really thankful to hear that you guys just stepped into that opportunity and didn't think too much about it. It was like, we're just here. And like, what is
Yeah.
it? I guess it's like we're gonna go 1 mile on this trail. We're just here how we show up, and I love hearing that because oftentimes I hear people of color feeling like this pressure of like how am I being perceived by other people who are used to being able to come to these spaces and recreate in them. So I'm really glad to hear that you didn't experience any of those like uncomfortable feelings.
One thing I will say though is that because I was like 14 at that time, so I think I wasn't very much aware of a lot of things that were happening around. But I think even though back then I didn't feel that way, as I've grown older and like, I've become more familiar with these spaces, I think that experience has definitely changed, unfortunately. And I've even like recently, I was working in Grand Teton National Park, and my family, they were one very excited to come out and visit me. And, even they were like, we never thought we'd be visiting Yellowstone. And they didn't even know what Grand Teton, like what that place was. And so for me, that was like really special to bring them out here. But after being like exposed to really, what like the conservation field is like, and working in these spaces, and like, like being surrounded by all these people, and like when I remember like feeling that pressure, which was really
Mm.
like sad. It was very much like it brought a lot of feelings because, and like, I feel like I've met a lot, even though throughout these experiences I've been exposed to maybe not the greatest like people, but I've also met a lot of other people that share like are like-minded. So I've had these conversations for like, okay, that was not okay, or why does this feel uncomfortable? Why, and even my parents, I think my parents even picked up on that, and it was really hard. And And I feel like that's why right now, especially because I'm just starting in this field, it's been like a year and a half, which I feel like so much has happened in this time. I feel like it's definitely been one of my biggest like um life um things that I'm like currently processing or like, exploring my feelings around that. So yeah, I wonder how I feel a little bit down the line because even though I felt very uncomfortable in I've, recently I felt very uncomfortable in a lot of spaces. I think I'm generally an optimistic person, but then that's not to say that those things are not, certain um behaviors that people will, I in the past I there's been like microaggressions towards me and like I do worry about like, people like looking at my family and I'm hyper aware of these situations and it's like in a way like it's to protect myself and my family and I really hate that I have to feel that way because and it makes me feel sometimes jealous of people who don't even have to worry about it, and I'm like, this is like so unfair. And then that's when all the negative feelings start coming out. But then it's like, okay, how do I deal with them? So it's an ongoing like progress for me currently. So I'm really, really happy that I'm having this conversation with you because I think it's definitely very important to talk about it.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing, Karla. You touched on something I had not even thought of before, and it was a couple of things actually that you mentioned that I just couldn't, I honestly had to hold back from reacting fully out loud. Was that one, your family wasn't even thinking about what they were doing or how they were being perceived in the outdoor spaces. You guys were just existing. And I love that. There's almost that saying that like ignorance is bliss, right? There's almost like that beauty and like being naive and not knowing sometimes some of these like these ideas, because I remember being in that place, and I've definitely worked in outdoor spaces and worked in outdoor education in some form, and have had to like share things about L&T principles, which is leave no trace for those who might not know. um or just other ways to recreate responsibly and safely, right? Not only for the spaces you're recreating in, but also for yourself. And I've definitely had those moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, I was once there and I made those silly mistakes. Like, for
Mm,
example, I've definitely thrown, and I'm so embarrassed to admit this, but it's okay because you learn. It's all about learning, right? That's why education is important. But I've definitely been that person who's like thrown, a piece of like a fruit or something on the ground, and then
mm,
not really made that connection of like, why could this be a bad thing? And So I appreciate you saying that, because I do remember recreating before when I had first ever gone to, any outdoor spaces, and not really understanding how it's important to really preserve these places, and just thinking like this place just exists and I'm just here. And I think
mm,
that's part of that, of like having those spaces so that we can enjoy our time in them. But then there's also the other end of, well, depending on if you're recreating responsibly or irresponsibly, you could be affecting somebody else's experience. You could be affecting, the protection of this place for other people to be able to come back and appreciate them in the future. So I'm not saying your family was recreating it responsibly, but it just kind of made me laugh about myself and my own experience of how silly I used to be and what I
mm,
didn't know. And now I do know, and I try to teach others and hopefully share some of that knowledge. But I think that does come with a lot of pressure. And then also knowing and having worked and lived in these spaces, and and I think really it's the outdoor culture, the community. Um,
yeah.
People who are working in the people who are working in these spaces, or people who are, living in these areas. There's definitely that like culture for sure. I feel like it's been described as like being like broy, but in a sense, like you do visualize someone who almost looks like a mountain man. It's like you think of a man, you think of a white man, someone who has like a beard, facial hair. They're wearing like a flannel t-shirt, and like, hiking pants, and like, some kind of name brand shoes with a backpack. Like you just think of that whole image. Whereas before we were in these spaces and really like working and living in them, I really never thought about that image too much. or like how I was looking in those spaces. I was just like, well, I'm here, I'm outside. Like, what's the most comfortable thing for me to wear at this moment? I didn't think too much about it until like kind of what you were saying and describing for yourself was that until you were really immersed in this like culture, in this world, did you actually think about things that before really didn't you hadn't thought too much about before. So I appreciate you sharing those perspectives because I think they're valuable and especially for those of us who did not grow up hiking and camping. There's a lot that we're still learning, and I'm so thankful to. I'm sure there's plenty of people that you have met who are open to sharing with you of like, oh, this is why it makes sense to wear this certain brand because it does come with clothing that's like that has SPF in it or whatever, right? It's like there's a reason for wearing it, not just because it's a brand, right? So I'm thankful for those people who are friendly. Um, I was wondering, Karla, how did you get your start in this field? Like, how did you go from Karla, who's 14, visiting the Grand Canyon with their family, to working in this kind of doing this kind of work? Like, where did that transition occur?
Um, I love that question. Um, none of this was planned for me, really.
Okay.
Not to say that I definitely feel like it makes sense looking back, like, because I definitely, and I love the work that I do. I think it's a very reciprocal work, as in like it feels that not only am I getting a lot out of it, and but I'm also giving back. Specifically, also, I love the fact that I get to give back to specific communities. Because a lot of even my working experience has come with working with like other underrepresented groups. So it feels very reciprocal, and I love that. I like right now, I can't picture myself doing anything else. Besides that, I really feel very happy about what I'm doing. Um, but my background's actually in environmental policy. Um, and I appreciate policy and like I think it's very important, but I definitely right now I that's not where I chose. That's not the path I decided to take. So right now I'm like an environmental educator, right? Um, but really what got me to what drew me to being outside. My mom is a huge green thumb. She loves gardening, so even though I'm like not very good at it, I would always go outside with her and we'd like take care of her plants or I'll help like I would help her with her gardening and um I love photography and I would just always take pictures of her plants and that was like oh my gosh like I love this tree or these flowers like seeing the blooms and because we have a really big garden at home we'd get like hummingbirds or like cardinals will come in and I'm very much like a huge like I love animals, so I always like I felt like I was always very drawn to them. And
Mm.
even now as an adult, like I feel like sometimes I find myself like getting really into a certain animal and then I'll like go into this like deep dive on this like specific species. Like I love all of that and I love capturing nature like through photography. Growing up when I would go to the beach, that was like my happy place. And so I just a lot of like my happiness was came from being outside. And even in I think I even like in school, like I just wanted to be outside. Like I wanted to be removed from the classroom. So a lot of what I do now is like outdoor education. So and like even like I remember like going to field trips and that being the highlight of my education. So that's why I feel like now it feels very reciprocal because especially because like I mean we went to the Grand Canyon but it was like we were going to all these places for like my family was more like oh we'll have like like a little Sunday outing but it wasn't really like we were planning all these like multiple vacations throughout the year really it was like okay we're going to the beach and then randomly in like 2014 we went to the Grand Canyon but that was it but I always felt like I wanted more of that and when I graduated college I started interning at this like national park I went to school in Tucson area so I started working at Saguaro National Park in education but really that opportunity came because I had like I did this previous job to that, more related on the policy side actually, and I interviewed the executive director of the Friends of Saguaro National Park. So I interviewed him. I wasn't like specifically seeking out working in a national park. And then he's like, "Oh, we're gonna be hiring educators. I don't know if you're interested." So that was my initial, and I actually, despite being in the Tucson area for like all through college, I had not been to Saguaro National Park, which is the case with a lot of people that live there. Um, so I guess there's like, and the job that I was doing prior to that, the policy related, was trying to figure out how to break down those barriers to the outdoors. So even from the get-go, I always had that interest. Okay, how can we get outside? Because I felt a lot of barriers, to the outdoors. So I interviewed the executive director. He's like, "Oh, you should probably apply to this." And so I do. I applied, and I that was like my first, taste of working in a national park. And that just sucked me in. And I have been doing educational work in a lot of these beautiful places now. And I feel incredibly lucky because it kind of came and it was like chance and it wasn't really planned. It was me taking those opportunities. And I remember having the worst like driving anxiety ever. And now I've like driven across like multiple state lines to, move all my stuff and pursue these like seasonal careers in these beautiful places. So that's why I said it's like, again, it feels like very reciprocal, where it's exposed me to a lot of new life experiences that I really don't think I really think it was that one decision. Maybe if I would have gone and like maybe decided not to apply to that, I would probably maybe, I don't know, I'd be working in an office, who knows, or somewhere else. So I
Mm.
think about that, and I don't know, I feel very lucky, and that's why I feel very happy about the work that I'm doing. Um, yeah, so it just kind of sucked me in, and here I am, and I truly like fell in love with it. I really, really enjoy working in conservation. Um, and I've learned a lot from working in this field. But I'm only, I'm a newbie, so this is definitely still new to me. So I'm still learning a lot still.
Thanks for sharing, Carla. I love that seed that was planted, for lack of a no pun intended, by your mom, who is a green thumb, on
Yeah.
your fascination and curiosity about plants, and nature, just like tending to something and wanting to take care of it, and watching it grow. It sounds like that really, like, just that is what helped grow your fascination for like wanting to learn about plants and animals and wanting to explore. But then it also grew your appreciation of like photography and wanting to like document some of these, what you were finding and what you're seeing. So it just sounds like you enjoy learning, but you also enjoy being able to share that with other people and having new experiences and adventures, and obviously spending time in beautiful places doesn't hurt. I get that, and I'm always fascinated of what brings people, especially people who don't have like the quote unquote like traditional background where like you grew up going to on vacations to national parks or whatever. Um, it's always interesting to hear that like there are those connections that truly connect many of us actually who are spending time in these places. We're drawn to them because of the beauty, but also what we get out of that and what we're able to give to those places as well. So I really appreciate you sharing that. That was really neat of you just taking that chance. But I think that's sounds like we have some common themes too about our experience and even my siblings' experience of just saying yes to sometimes those opportunities that might be a little uncomfortable or scary, but we've grown from them. So I do have a question for you because you kind of touched on this, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind elaborating. Is you said you've grown a lot, in this time that you've kind of started this career that you weren't really intending to start, but now you're kind of on this path, and it's still kind of new. But what do you feel is the biggest thing that you have learned about yourself in this time since saying yes to that opportunity, what, a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, to where you are now? What's your biggest lesson that you've learned about yourself?
I feel that um not necessarily like I think becoming comfortable with chaos. I think there's a lot of magic that comes out of chaos. Because even though this is like, oh, this is amazing and I love what I do, I definitely had moments where I very much like suffer with a lot of like imposter syndrome. Like that actually is like one of the biggest things that I constantly have to work through. Um, and I'm hoping that like, it's like for me, it's like a practice. I feel like, it's like reassuring myself that, okay, yes, I belong in these spaces, even though like, sometimes looking around like the people that I work with, I'll be the only person of color, or like I feel that like cultural shock. So it's, unfortunately, I have found myself being like, well, do I like really belong here? Or like I find myself like comparing these experiences or feeling, because again, like this is very much new to me. It's like I won't know a lot of these things, or I feel like uncomfortable, or I've never, I remember like my first backpacking trip, I was like, I don't really know what I'm doing. Like maybe I'm not wearing the right shoes. I don't even own a backpacking backpack, that type of things. Um, but becoming comfortable with those uncomfortable feelings and the chaos, those like I feel like in the past it's been easy for me to, really like that's why like I try my heart like self-care, like learning that I need to dedicate, like have moments of just like myself and really just sitting down with my feelings is really important for me, and becoming comfortable with the chaos that comes with um coming into brand new spaces, especially because a lot of the work that I've done has been seasonal, where I'm like starting a new job every 6 months, which does not have to be the case for everybody. That's just what I'm doing right now. But, that chaos can be like very much like, oh, like, I wonder what this space is going to be like. Is it gonna be a good community? Well, will I have to go through this like entire like culture shock, where like, am I gonna feel uncomfortable because, it's like you never know what you're gonna get in these spaces. But I think there's a lot of beauty and magic that comes from chaos, and that same chaos that has felt very much that has made me feel like, oh, like very like push me to moments where I'm like, maybe I should just go back home and like pursue another career, or maybe I should just give up on this. Um, but somehow I always find myself going back to, okay, no, like again, like holding on to that little spark. And I feel like I've become very comfortable with it. And I think that's why I consider myself an optimistic person, which I'm glad I am, because um, I do feel that a lot of the times, especially as a person of color, like there is a lot of like systemic issues that are still very much present, and I think that need to be talked about. And I can definitely see why a lot of people of color, eventually do decide to leave this field, because conservation is very white dominated, and um, it's very much, that those like biases or like prejudices or like just like racist behavior towards people of color are very much there on your face. And that can be very challenging. And it's not the, our responsibility to deal with that. And but I think we can choose how to react to that. And everybody's different. I don't think nobody should be tolerating that. Like, and of course everybody has different experiences, but so I respect whatever route people decide to take. Um, so yeah, and again, like I said, this has been like an ever, I think it's I'm not like, obviously like right now this is how I feel, but things might change down the line, and I'm very much aware of that, and I would be open to that as well. I think about me, I also like just like me as a person, I have a lot of I feel like, oh, I'm like pursuing like my dream career in this field. And, I could very much be like pursuing like a different, like dream career that I have. Like, I think that I have like multiple buckets where I can go to and like pick from. Um, but yeah, I think getting comfortable with the chaos and like seeing the magic that comes with chaos, and like that is like my constant inspiration.
I love that. What I'm hearing from all you're saying, and I love that, like I could tell it was like unfolding the introspection. It was really neat to like watch and listen to. So thank you for going there with me and sharing a piece of your story that's like sound, I could tell it's something that you've definitely thought about a lot and has evoked a lot of emotions in you, all, good, bad, all of the above. Um, we don't need to go into what we already know about is the systemic racism. We don't even need to know about that because we talk about that enough. We live through it every day, especially those of us who come from marginalized communities. That's our life. Unfortunately, we can't ignore it. So we don't need to go into that. But what I do want to know is if you don't mind sharing, you mentioned self-care and you mentioned, just connecting with your why almost without actually saying that. And I was wondering, Karla, in those moments when things feel really tough and you're doubting, like, why am I here? Why am I continuing to do what I do? Especially putting yourself in places where you don't always see yourself represented or you don't always feel that support. You're experiencing those microaggressions you know, what gets you through those moments, Karla? Like how are you able to be able to like push through those moments? It sounds like you've gone through a lot and you've experienced a lot, but you've been able to continue to push through them. So what gets you through those moments?
First of all, I always give myself grace. Um, because I definitely have had times where I will be very reactive to these feelings. And um even though like I allow myself to sit with these thoughts, like I haven't always, I can acknowledge that, okay, maybe this is not the way that I should be handling this. And so, but then I do give myself that grace. Okay, like I'm still learning from a lot of this. And because I didn't mention this, but like being first generation, I did like grow up in Mexico. And um even after, like ultimately, doing my like kind of making my life in America, I was still in southern Arizona, like the Tucson area, where I was around a lot of like Hispanic people, and it's a college town, so you get like it's a very diverse and rich, like culturally rich town or city now. So, and I think that was like the biggest thing for me because even though I was working at Saguaro National Park, then last summer is when I moved to Wyoming. And that was like the biggest culture shock that I had ever experienced. So it was like very much like I was very reactive to these emotions. And then after having like sat with the thoughts and feelings, I was like, okay, like give yourself some grace. Like actually, like even though you were like in America, where these are like persistent, like, issues, to like that impact like communities of color, but you are very much removed from like coming from like a very diverse place. You're in Wyoming where it's like not very, it's very white and there's not a lot of representation or diversity. So I allowed myself like I gave myself the grace to go through those emotions and deal with them the way I knew how to in that moment. And um, just being kind to myself was a big priority. And I took things very slowly. And I feel like that's one thing that I constantly remind myself is that I don't need to be, I like pace myself because I'm a very much a go, go, go person. And I will like, in those moments of and in this like rapid pace, especially because I do work in a fast-paced environment. Like in a on like off the clock, then I'm like, okay, slow down, give yourself the grace to deal with whatever you're dealing with, or sit with your thoughts. And then I do, just as another way to take care of myself, I am a very vocal person. I do like talking about these things. And one thing I'll say is that I don't feel very comfortable talking about these things to anybody and everyone. But I'm very thankful that I've been able to find people that I can feel safe with and have these conversations with. And I've made like not a ton of friends that will, um are like-minded, but I've made like maybe one or two that are very much like, okay, but that's how I know, even though it's like not like a handful of them, but it's like, okay, these people like really understand this, or even if they don't necessarily, um, because I've had like other people that don't necessarily have to share the same background that I do, but will, are they listen. And I think that's very important, to find like a support system. And even me saying this, like even in the past, like finding a support system can be tough. Like some people are not, don't always have a support system, but I've been very lucky recently that I've found a support system through friends, through like family. And also I do one of my biggest drivers into just continuing in this field is that because I do work with a lot of underrepresented communities, like in the past, I've worked with Title I schools, and these are kids that are very much like, there's a lot of like Hispanic or like Black folk, and I'm like, okay, I think about myself as a kid, and who had never been really exposed to like these environments. And even back then, I can't even think. I mean, I remember like the field trips that I went to and not being really present. But now that I'm older, I really, really do think that just coming in like as an educator, and because because I mean, as a person, I love talking to people. I like finding connections and helping people bridge that connection with like the environment, no matter what that looks like, or just like spark like at least some interest. Like if I can get like just one little thing, um get them thinking about, like it can be like a little flower or like a rock, the smallest thing. And I do think it's very impactful. Like I've even seen it in the kids that I've worked with, like just seeing their face light up is, and I think that's what's like very rewarding of the job. So I think the audience that I work with, and don't get me wrong, like there's like a bunch of like different people, but specifically those like people of those communities, like that's what keeps me going because I know how incredibly difficult it can be. Maybe not necessarily for all of them, but for a lot of them. um so again, like coming back to like it's a very reciprocal thing. um so I would say that there's multiple like factors to what keeps me going, like taking care of myself, and then seeing what I give back is like really rewarding, and that is like my constant motivation to continue doing what I do.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks, Karla. Yes. Everything you're saying, yes. I can relate in so many ways to your story and just kind of what you've described as far as, your reasoning for continuing, because it's not easy. And, I appreciate you making sure to acknowledge that part of it, but also the beauty as well, right? And they say that like there's this idea of, we can only grow and like the most profound growth occurs when you're the most uncomfortable. Like when you're pushing yourself beyond what you thought is your limit is where you're really able to like learn more about yourself, but also see what you can really do. So thank you for being out here representing, and I appreciate you, being willing to put up sometimes with those uncomfortable moments, but being open to the growth that those moments have brought you, and also continue to do that good work because it's not for everyone, and I don't think it's everyone's responsibility to be that representation in these spaces where it's very limited. But for those of us who have chosen to be here and do that work, like I'm thankful that I'm not alone and that I have someone else who can relate. But yeah, more of us that keep doing this work is what's going to be that difference that we want to see. And I also appreciate you highlighting the nuances with America, right? It's just, I think a lot of people, when they're not people who don't live in America, there's always this idea of like New York or Los Angeles, and like people think of these like big cities, but I think they forget about sometimes those very rural locations that look very homogenous and that are not, ethnically or culturally very diverse. And I've noticed that having grown up in California as well, I have never really traveled outside of California until I was an adult. And it has been eye-opening traveling to different states in the US and realizing that this little special bubble that I've been in this whole time, having gone to school and grown up in places that are very multicultural and diverse, is very different than a lot of the rest of America's experience. And although majority of folks do live in or near an urban space, there's definitely still folks who have not had those opportunities or they've been exposed to things that are different from them. And that definitely brings out a lot in folks. But it's true. It's very true that yeah, it's not all liberal and open-minded everywhere. So thanks for touching on that as well, because I think that's an important part of where that culture shock does come from. And why those experiences, we're not always prepared to be put in those places that's very different in ways than what we've grown up and the ways that we've grown up and where we've grown up. But also, yeah, that's going to be challenging because you haven't been placed in situations like that. I do have, I feel like you've touched on a lot of the questions I wanted to ask you, but the last question I want to ask you, Karla, is what would you like to see change regarding representation in the outdoors? What voices do you feel like are missing, and how can we invite those voices or those identities to be represented in these spaces?
Yeah, great. I think that it's, especially working in these spaces, I think there is, even though it's like not really, it's like an unspoken thing that you come to these beautiful places and yeah, everybody's like rocking all these brands
Mhm.
uh and there's like an idea of what being an outdoorsy person looks like. And I think just redefining, what being outside is. And even coming into, these beautiful like parks or like monuments or forests, like I still very much see that expectation from the public, which again, there's like a difference with like, okay, we want to make sure that people are recreating safely and, because overall we do want to like conserve and like maintain these beautiful spaces. But then also I think on the side of these like big like orgs or like agencies, I think I would like to see like more responsibility, or even just like when it comes to bringing on like a team of people, I still think they're not quite there yet with, because a lot of these like big orgs or like agencies, they are like what, these like public lands, public spaces are for the people of the country. And even though um there, it's like at the end of the day, it's a very it's a country composed of a lot of different folk, like a lot of different culture and backgrounds. And I don't think we're quite yet there with um, the representation of these people when it comes to like the lands. And I think that's why a lot of people that, even though my family, coming back to what you said, like ignorance is bliss. I very much felt like that growing up. Now that I'm an adult, like I definitely, well, I've had like those uncomfortable feelings, and I think that has like my feelings. Unfortunately, I think my family is aware too, and I obviously talk about my experiences with my family, and so I think they are have also been like, okay, like our daughters like working in these spaces, and I've even seen them become uncomfortable with being outside. And that's like really heartbreaking. But then it's like, okay, don't worry about how you're being perceived. But again, I think it's because they don't see themselves being represented. Because then again, I will talk to people, other friends who get their families outwardly have been like, we did not go to these places because they weren't for us. It's like that feeling. It was very much that these people felt that, you know, these spaces were not for them, and that's why they didn't feel comfortable entering them. And I still think there's a lot of that. So I would like to see more representation when it comes to these like agencies, like the people that they bring on, and also just like training. I think a lot of work is still could be done like internally on how a lot of the times you'll see like officials or like rangers or like people working these spaces where they're not necessarily in
Mhm.
practice
Mm.
putting on like a welcoming environment, or like inviting energy towards um you know other different groups. And I think that's why, like, for me, like I think it's really, and I want to be here is because I sometimes it feels like, okay, I'll be there whenever I speak Spanish. So I think whenever I see like a family that is like, like trying to communicate with like another person who doesn't speak English, like I'll immediately like be like, I speak Spanish, I can help you. And just seeing the way that they're like, oh my gosh, like thank God. And just so I think like, hire more like bilingual or like trilingual or like, like more different like people that can be helpful to the multiple different faces that we have in our country. I think that is something that I would like to see, just more representation overall. And also, one thing that I've noticed in conservation is that there's a lot of internships that target, like POC and like these underrepresented communities, but they don't have, permanent positions available for them. And I think that's a huge issue.
Mm.
And I think that really, you know, at the end, and also like tying back to like a lot of, not all of these programs. There's some really great programs like NPSA Academy. Um, there are some, and even just because I've had like experiences myself where I feel like, you bring all these folk in, but you don't give them you don't make them feel comfortable. You don't give them the tools to support themselves. And, people are encouraged to advocate for themselves, but then seeing how, um, in the end, even by advocating yourself, you're being treated differently. Like I think internally that is a big, big issue, um, that I would like to see some change, like more like career like commit actually to helping these people if you really want to be intentional with your programming, I think. um so yeah, I think there's a lot of things. But I think that's why it's very important for us to talk about it. And I think just myself being here and you, Deja, I think we're both very like vocal people, and like we stand up for what we believe. And um so I think we're onto something, or I think we're definitely um getting there. I wish it were a little bit faster is the thing. Because it can be, I understand why people get frustrated. I get frustrated myself, but I'm still very hopeful, and I do have a lot of people around me that are, that are listening and, being helpful and like advocating with me as well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, Karla, name that made me tear up a little bit actually listening to you because yeah, it's hearing about that experience with you and like coming across other people who are like mainly Spanish speaking and are having a hard time being able to like navigate or just get assistance and they're here to also enjoy these spaces that are public, emphasis on public.
Yeah.
Yes, it should be welcoming to anybody, any group. Not only do we get people from all across the US that come from all different backgrounds because they call the US a melting pot, but we
Yeah.
also get people who come from all over the world to visit these public lands. And so, if that's the case, then we should make sure that we have resources in place, training in place, so that the people who are working in these locations can better support the demographics that are coming to visit them. So, thank you for touching on that. I also agree with we can't say I think it's starting to get tricky right nowadays with a lot of organizations saying that, oh, we want to make sure we're being more inclusive. So we're going to hire more people of color or people who come from marginalized backgrounds, or we're going to hire people who are LGBTQ plus, et cetera. And
Hmm.
then and that's the thing I'm noticing too. There's a disconnect there, right? Yes, it's
Hmm.
great you want to hire these people or give these opportunities, right, to these folks, but I'm not seeing it go a step beyond that. And how are we
Hmm.
supporting these folks when they're actually in these positions, experiencing these uncomfortable experiences? How are we supporting them through those moments? And that's such a good point that you say too of, oh, we're trying to tell folks to advocate for themselves is that even made me question myself as a supervisor for one of these programs is,
Hmm.
I remember having a moment recently. I was actually at a ski resort and there was a man who was like elbowing me like on my shoulder. Let me tell you, like we were not in a crowded area, but say this to say that I was feeling very uncomfortable. And I was like, the first time I was like, oh, it's probably an accident. Second time I was like, okay, like you really didn't need to do that to me in my head. Third
Mhm.
time I was like, okay, this really is not okay. This is inappropriate. And now I feel like this is almost intentional. This person is doing this.
Yeah.
I ended up getting on the lift chair and not saying anything. And I remember talking to my partner who is white and male. And I was telling him what happened to me. And he's like, oh, well, I give somebody like two chances. And then by the second time I say something to them. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great and all. But being not only am I a woman, but I'm a woman of color,
Uh,
it's like it's unspoken rule for people of color and especially women to stay quiet. Keep your head down and don't rock the boat. And so it's not always easy for me, nor does it always feel safe for me to advocate for myself or speak up. I feel like it's just very tricky on how you navigate those situations. So I appreciate you bringing that point up as well, is that if we were going to hire people from diverse backgrounds, we need to be able to support them in these positions as well. And sometimes these folks are going to need support that typical, employees of these spaces maybe didn't need before. But I will leave it at that. Uh, I do have actually one more question based off of what you had said, Karla, and
mhm.
that is, how does it feel for your family and friends to now know someone who works in the outdoors? Like, has that changed their perspective of what those spaces look like for them now or how they experience them? I mean, you touched on now they're thinking a little bit of how they're looking when they're in these spaces, but does that give them some kind of solace to know that like someone that looks like them and comes from their background is now like working in these spaces? Like, has that changed the experience for them in a positive way at all to know you?
I would say, sorry, I'm just gonna wait for this car to pass by.
You're good. I actually could barely hear it.
Okay, sweet. Um, yeah, I would say so. I feel like because I'm working in these spaces, they can more easily, like, they have like more access to them. They're like, oh, sweet. Like, they feel more comfortable just like coming in because they know that I will be here and I can like help them navigate the space. So I'm happy to like be like the helping hand, like, okay, like this is where we go. And like even this past time that my parents came up to Grand Teton and like we went up to Yellowstone, they were like amazed the entire time and they're like, "Oh, wow, like you really have this, this down. Like you know what you're doing." And they just like overall feel more comfortable. So like even now that I'm like working in another beautiful place, they're like, "Oh, we want to come out and visit you." And like even just like I feel like even though, yeah, there has been like there's been like, okay, there's a little bit more concern of how they're perceived. I think that's like that we can work through. And I think just like with what I've learned, I can like help them navigate those feelings as well. And then we can focus on like like because overall I want like my family and friends to enjoy these spaces. So like I'm also not gonna, just constantly be talking about that. Like I want them to get the most out of these like gorgeous spaces. So, like focus on like, okay, I really want to take you out to this beautiful place that I think you're really gonna enjoy. And like, yes, it's gonna be like a 8 mile hike, but I promise you that it's gonna be all right if we, and I try to like be because it's again like, and it's just particularly for my parents, it's like very new, and like just for my siblings as well. So like just like here and there, like trying to be like, okay, um, maybe you want to like wear like these shoes instead, or like make sure you stay hydrated. Just like overall, like the more logistical things, I feel like makes them feel more comfortable and safe in these spaces. And I think that's a huge like perk that comes to like working in these spaces, that I kind of take out that like intimidating aspect of things. So and like even my parents were like, when I remember taking them up to Yellowstone and then being like, oh, we always saw like, like Yellowstone and like these like Nat Geo documentaries, and never did we think we'd be here. And I'd be like, well, because I feel like even, and I'll just say this, because this is very, like I come from like a, um, conservative Hispanic household. So even me, like coming into this like field was very much like, what are you doing? They're like, when are you gonna get like a real job? So I feel like even that has been like another like that's like a whole nother thing that we can talk about later. But I have had that pushback from my family.
Mm,
And and that was like another thing that added to like a lot of my feelings, like, having this pushback from my own family. Um, or then just like seeing how I've like had to navigate through like the unknown and like the uncomfortable, like chaotic moments. They're like, well, you should probably just like come back home and like do this instead. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do that just yet. Um, so I feel like they've also become like they're more open minded now, because I think really I like push back, like ultimately I always do what I want to do, and I think that has like really opened they're a little bit more open to these like new experiences, which I love to see. Um so yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. I think it's really helped them feel more comfortable.
thanks. Thanks for sharing that. Oh, that's so real. Like my family has no clue the work that I do. I think, yes, the last 7-ish years, they have no clue what I do for work. Um, and yes, a lot of my family thinks I just live out in the middle of the woods with like no electricity or anything, and that I'm hunting for my food. So, they definitely were like, why are you there and what's going on? But yeah, I'm so glad that you get to share with your family and your friends of like what you've learned and that it has had a profound change on them and as give them opportunities to be open to new exciting adventures. It's funny because every time we have family or friends come visit, my fiance and I, it's always people always think we're gonna take them to the top of a peak. Always like I feel like they preface it's like, okay, but I think I can only walk a mile or two. I don't want to. We're like, we don't always have to do things to the extreme. We also know how to do things in a way like where we can
Mhm.
go sit by a river and hang out for a
Yeah.
little or we can go on like a scenic walk or drive somewhere where it's a great view. It doesn't always have to be doing things to the extreme. So I think there's also this perception that we're gonna like take them somewhere scary and like torture them.
Yeah.
But we also can do it in a way where it's like, yes, you might be a little uncomfortable, but we're never gonna push you some doing something that we don't think you can do. And we also make sure it's gonna be worth it. But Karla, thank you so much for. I feel like we could talk for hours about so many different topics related to what we've talked about already today, but I really
Mhm.
just appreciate you existing. Thank you so much for being you, and I'm so thankful that you are here, you're doing the work, and that you haven't been scared away. I'm appreciative to be a part of your journey as well. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me today and be on my show as my second guest. So thank you so much. So much of what you shared has resonated with me personally. And I see, we come from kind of almost in some ways very different backgrounds, I think, on paper. But yeah, it was also another moment, like hearing another person of color share their story. I felt seen through your story. And so it honestly there's times I teared up hearing you share about your experience, the good and the bad. And I appreciate you so much. So thank you again for joining me today. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you have any last thoughts that you wanted to share before we wrap up. I want to give you the space to do that. But yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so, so happy we got to chat about this. And I know we can definitely like keep talking for hours about like a bunch of other like things that come with these experiences themselves. And yeah, thank you so much for what you're doing. I think this is an amazing project, and I'm so, so excited to see where this goes. I know you're killing it, and you are awesome. And I think you bring a lot of value to the world and just like this field. And I'm really happy to see you and like know you. And yeah, I feel very lucky to have you in my life as well. And I think this has been the highlight of my day, the highlight of my week. So thank you so much for having me. Um, I'm definitely open to having like another conversation with you in the future whenever. But yeah, thank you so much, Deja.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah, I was just thinking that. I was like, okay, I feel like we need a part two. So we'll definitely have to talk about what part two could consist of because I think there's definitely more there, but and I can only imagine, the folks who identify with some of what you shared today might want to hear some more from you. So we'll see what we hear from folks and what we can talk about more next time. But thank you again, Karla, and yeah, I look forward to more discussions both on screen and off.
Of course, absolutely.
Thank you for checking out this episode of Black and Wild. I hope that you found some part of the discussion that you could relate to. I want to say thank you again to my guest, Karla, for being vulnerable and open during our discussion. This conversation was a great reminder that although on paper people may appear to be different from one another, we may have more in common than we initially think. There are so many parts of Karla's story that resonated with me. So be on the lookout for the next episode of Black and Wild, where I have another discussion with more friends who come from underrepresented backgrounds. Until next time, see ya.